I'm working on this John Deere 110 garden tractor. This is part 8 of a multi-part series. In the last video, I cleaned the engine block and I got the governor shaft working right. Next, I'm going to use a wire brush on the rusted areas. That knocks off enough stuff to smooth up the surface a little bit. Here's the pile of parts that came off of the engine last, so that's what I'm putting back on first. I need the governor arm. Here's the bolt that was in it. It has a washer on it. I need another washer, and then the nut. The spring goes in that little slot there, and one of those legs is bent. I'm going to straighten that up. When this goes on, you need to put the end of the spring in that slot and make sure there's a gap between this arm and the brass bushing. I'm going to snug the nut just to keep the arm in place for now. It can't be adjusted until after the throttle cable and carburetor are in place. That's what you get there. These two parts are connected by the spring, so they move together. When you move the throttle cable to high speed, it pulls down on this small arm, and as the engine approaches high speed, the governor pulls back on this arm to keep it from going too fast. The coil's going on last because it'll just get in the way. I'm going to do the points next. I know this engine's been sitting a long time, so I'm going to take the points apart to clean them. First, I wipe them off and make sure they're dry. It takes some pressure to get the file to dig into the point surface, so I'm going to need an anvil. And I file them pretty hard. Even doing it this way, there's usually a pit left somewhere. They can be pretty deep. I'm not trying to make them flat. The surface should be rounded, with the center sticking up higher. So if there's any misalignment, the contact point will still be toward the center. You just don't want your points touching on the edge of the round pad. Here's what they look like now, and there's a pit left in both of them. That's my compromise. I'd have to take off a good amount of material to get rid of that last pit. That rubber grommet's mangled. I think I can get it to fit into the hole somewhat. I'm going to put a little dab of grease on the push rod. First, you want to rotate the engine and find the spot where the points are open the most. That's where it needs to be when checking the gap. This is a 20 thousandths feeler gauge. and it can flop around in there, so that gap's too big. You want to loosen the screw but keep it snug so you can use the slot on top to pry it into position. When I think I have the gap right, I snug the screw some more, make sure it didn't move, and then tighten the screw all the way, and make sure it didn't move. Okay, that looks good. I had to move this wire out of the way so I could tighten the screw in the block. It needs to be over to the left so the wire lines up with the hole in the cover. Here's a new gasket for the cover. There's a slot around the grommet so it slides onto the cover. That needs to be in position before you tighten it. There's 2 lock washers on there. They don't come off easily, and it looks like they were always on there. I'm going to leave it that way and call it original. This coil has enough rust on it that I want to wire brush the outside. I'll take off these nuts and washers so they don't go flying. And I'll take off the bottom bracket. The wire wheel don't fit next to these terminal posts, so I'll wire brush those by hand. The bottom of this is swelled out a little. Sometimes that happens when the coil goes bad. This bracket's not symmetrical. The slots were towards the bottom of the coil when I took it apart, and you can tell where it was by the paint marks. I wire brushed this small hardware but didn't show it on camera. One of the small washers was missing, so I got another one of those. The condenser was mounted on the left side, and only one of these bolts has a flat washer. You need to use a flat washer for both sides on the coil bracket. On the left side, the condenser mount can act as a flat washer, and the flat washer is used on the right side. If I slide the coil to the right in the slots, I can use the socket to get to the bolt that's buried, and I'll use a regular wrench to get to the other one. Remember, the points and condenser has to connect to the negative terminal on the coil. In this case, I put the coil back where it was based on the paint marks, but you still need to make sure it wasn't put together wrong before. This other nut just needs to be on far enough that I don't lose it. I'm thinking about putting this engine back on the frame. I'm not going to change the oil because it looks pretty clean and it's pretty close to the full mark on the dipstick. If it was black or too full or too low, I'd change the oil before starting the engine. This choke cable's been laying out on the frame, but it's supposed to go through this hole and under the engine. I also have this wiring harness. It feeds power and ground to the headlights. The ground is connected to the starter housing bolt on the engine, but the power wire used to go under the engine. If you look at this end, it's been pinched or cut. The cut mark almost lines up with this frame here. These two green wires go to the light switch. I can use one of them to run the headlights and the other one to run the tail light if there is one. I think I can do that after the engine's in place, so I'm going to forget about the wiring harness for now. Here we go. Trying not to pinch the cables. This choke cable needs to run behind the flywheel backing plate, right next to the block, so it can come through that slot. I forgot to put the belt around the pulley, and right now it looks like it's not long enough to go there. I need to position this variable speed pulley stuff so I can work with the belt. If I move this lever, that moves it towards the rear, so that would make things worse. If I push on the clutch, that moves it forward, but I'd have to clamp the pedal down somehow. Looking at the bottom of the tractor, I figured out that I could raise up on this spring-loaded pulley in the rear and remove the belt from the side of the variable speed pulley. That lets this pulley center section slide over. That should give me more room to get the belt on. Yep, that's good. The belt's loose enough that I can move the engine around where I want it without the belt pulling on one side. This is the next batch of stuff that needs to go on. I'm going to go ahead and clean everything that's here. What I really need next is these engine mounting bolts. Like usual, first I'm going to scrape off the big chunks. Choosing from this pile of parts, I'm going to clean the carburetor first before the solvent gets dirty. This part has some thick, dirty grease that don't come off very well. I'm going to set it aside and work on that later. Here's the pile of parts after cleaning. I need these 4 engine bolts out of here. On the frame, there's 2 holes on one side, then 2 slots on the other side. If you put the 2 bolts in the holes first, the other 2 bolts in the slots will go right in. When I took it apart, these 4 bolts just had lock washers, but since 2 of these are slots, I'm going to put a flat washer under each lock washer on the slotted holes. Before I tighten the first 2 bolts, I'm going to push the engine to one side. That should rotate the engine close to parallel with the frame. Well, that's as far as I'm going this time, and here's what it looks like. It looks about the same, but the engine is bolted down, and the ignition system's in place. Alright, that's it.